So I just watched a conference reports video, Fred's video, about the ontological argument for the existence of God, and I think Fred has kind of cleverly inverted the argument so that it proves the non-existence of God. As Fred mentioned, this argument originated with Saint Anselm in the medieval period, and it basically amounts to this idea that we have this idea of God, and that makes it at least a possibility, right? But if part of this idea of God is what would later come to be called infinite substance, or that God is the greatest thing that can exist, then the greatest thing that can exist must also, therefore, actually possess existence, because existence would, of course, be part of this concept or this idea of greatness. I was never really convinced at all by this idea. I think the first time I heard it, it was as if I was still waiting for the punchline. It just doesn't compute, and of course, for the medieval philosophers like Anselm, ideas were objective. That word had a different meaning in the medieval period, but for them, ideas were not subjective in the sense that they were just made up inside of my head or inside of your head, and then, if we're lucky, expressed with language or other media. Rather, ideas were universals. They sort of exist independently of any particular person's mind. You could say they exist in the mind of God, and so are there available for finite individual creatures, like human beings at least, the rational animal, the rational creature. The ideas are sort of there, floating in heaven, waiting for us to reach up and grab them with our conceptual thoughts. Now, still though, even if you put Anselm in that medieval context when ideas were still objective, his argument just doesn't seem all that convincing to me. And part of the problem, I think, emerges later on in the modern period with the prototypical modern philosopher René Descartes, who builds his own version, reconstructs his own version of the ontological argument. But you see in Descartes this contradiction, which still kind of confuses me, because I'm not sure how a thinker as rigorous and clear-headed as Descartes could have missed this. But he had a conception of God as, more than anything else, all-powerful. And unlike any of his medieval forerunners, or even his contemporaries in the early modern period, he believed that God was so powerful that he could make 2 + 3 = 7. Or God could scramble the rules of logic such that, just because Socrates is mortal doesn't also mean he's human. Or the point being here that for Descartes, God was not subject to what we think of as the truth. God could change the truth. So if you think back to Plato's dialogue, an ancient philosopher now, the Euthyphro, Plato has Socrates discover in this dialogue that God, the gods, are good because it's good, not because they make the good, but because the good is sort of superordinate to them. They are its subordinates. So the good, God must, or the gods must, in this sense, obey the laws of goodness. Whereas for Descartes, the law is God's will. So God makes the law. God doesn't obey the law. God is superordinate to the good. So things get flipped around in the modern period. But where Descartes contradicts himself, I think, is while he wants to hold this conception of God as all-powerful, even more powerful than the good, he also accepts, sort of just in passing, the old medieval understanding of God as not pure power, but pure act, right? Pure existence. God is the most actual being. God is full being, really, and everything else is a sort of falling away from full being. But, so, you see the contradiction here, that Descartes both wants to have an all-powerful God, a God of infinite potency, of infinite capacity, and also a God of full existence, of already having actualized itself as infinite. So there's a contradiction here between actuality, and power, or potential, potency. How can God have both of these attributes at once, right? Now, in a thinker, you could say a late modern thinker, if we now exist in the postmodern period, but a late modern thinker like Friedrich Schelling, when he approaches this problem, I think he ends up, well, he kind of reminds all of these Christian philosophers that the Trinity is at the center of their religion and their philosophy, their theology. And what Schelling does is look at the nature of God in terms of the Trinity as three sort of circulating, co-constitutive powers. The first two powers are potency and actuality, or as Schelling called them, ground and existence. So God has within itself ground and existence, where ground is associated with potency, which here means this kind of abyssal, groundless darkness that is so dark that it eats itself, so dark that it loses itself in that darkness. And God's other power here of these first two is God's existence, which you could say is God's desire to reveal God's self, to expand, to encompass. This is God as radiant light, whereas the other of these first two powers is God as darkness, fallen darkness. Now, the third potency, the third power in Godhead, in the Godhead, is what you could call spirit or love, and it's the mediating principle that brings God's darkness or God's ground into existence, brings it in relation to God's existence, or God's light. You know, you could also associate these first two powers with good and evil, and then spirit, the third principle, would be freedom. But really, that's what this divine Trinitarian circulating event we call, Godhead. That's what it's doing in its human form. Good, evil, and freedom are really human concerns. God doesn't seem, those ideas don't seem relevant to God. God is beyond good and evil. good and evil are a human problem. And of course, when we deal with human problems, philosophy has to understand. I think what Schelling is trying to do really is understand God from a human perspective. So you could say he's being anthropomorphic, but of course you could also say that he's a kind of cosmomorphic thinker, and that he wants to remake the human in the image of nature, of the cosmos. And when Schelling talks about the Trinity, he's not just talking about Godhead. He's talking about the sort of archetypal patterning of threeness that is evident everywhere in nature. If our philosophy of nature, at least, and our philosophy of science are healthy, they would discover this triplicity in the nature of things, and it wouldn't just be an idea that we're imagining in our head, trying to prove the existence of a far-off great God. So there's an intuitive dimension to the Trinity, I think, if it makes any sense at all to you. If it doesn't make any sense to you, it's as a symbol. If it sounds like nonsense, then well, one of two things is possible. Either I'm and hundreds of millions of other believers, and maybe a great number of, not that many as believers, but a great number of philosophers nonetheless, who thought that they had reached some kind of an understanding, at least on a moral and aesthetic level, of the Trinity. So either me and the rest of those people are crazy, or maybe you are, or maybe we're all a little mad, and just trying to assist one another's convalescence. So there's my own ontotheoanthrological proof of the existence and the non-existence of God.